Hi everyone. So before I play you this video of me having a chat with Gavin Ashenden, who's a really lovely guy to talk to, about 40 years, he was in the Anglican clergy, he was an Anglican bishop, he was even the chaplain to the Queen of England before he felt that he got pushed out of that for his views, and he'll explain all of that in this video that you'll see. Before I show you that, of course, sorry, and then he of course became a Catholic, and that's why he's talking to me on Catholic Talk. But I just want to go through a couple of issues that I had with this chat. It was some technical issues, some technical hiccups. Basically, I decided to connect the Mac to my phone's internet for this interview, thinking that it would make things better. Um, Generally, when I use the Wi-Fi from the home, it's fine, but very occasionally it has some issues. So I thought if I connect it to my phone's internet, and my phone's going to be right there beside the Mac, there won't be any problems because it'll just be a straight flow to the Mac and there won't be any issues. But actually, there were more issues than there normally are. So there are some areas where the picture, usually it's actually generally when Gavin is talking, goes a bit funny. He's either frozen or granulated or something isn't right with the picture. And in those moments, I just replace that kind of funny, not so good quality picture with a screenshot of Gavin Ashenden. So you can still hear him talking, but instead you just see a screenshot of him. And then when the picture improves again, I go back to him actually talking, and you can see him talking. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is with the audio, generally the audio is fine for most of the video, but there are a couple of rare areas where it's a little bit difficult to understand, perhaps, for a few seconds. So in those moments, again, I do put some subtitles so you can read what Gavin Ashenden has actually said. But those are very rare. Generally, the audio is absolutely fine. It's just an issue with the picture. And you'll notice that a few times it goes to a screenshot of Gavin Ashenden and then it goes back to him again talking. But in the meantime, you can still hear the whole thing. So if you just like to listen to this, I mean, it is essentially two guys just sitting down talking, so there isn't that much to watch. If you just like to listen, the audio is generally fine for the whole thing. And yeah, I just want to make you aware of that. But anyway, that's enough from me now with the prelude. And here we go. Here's my chat slash interview slash discussion with Gavin Ashenden. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Catholic Talk. I'm very happy to have Gavin Ashenden with me today, who, like my previous guest, Anne Widdecombe, is a former Anglican, now Catholic, but unlike my previous guest, is actually a former Anglican bishop. So, Gavin, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's nice to talk to you.
Thank you for being here. And what I want you to do, if that's okay, particularly for the audience who might be from the outside of the UK, who might not know that much about you, because you're a former Anglican, if you could just explain to them a little bit about your upbringing. Were you raised in an Anglican household? And did you, how did you find Anglicanism? Was it straight away, or did you kind of find it later on in life? And what then made you become a priest, an Anglican priest?
So these are questions that can be answered in 90 seconds or 90 hours, and it's getting the right format and scale so people don't get terribly bored. I think the most formative part of my upbringing was that I was sent away to a school built around Canterbury Cathedral. And the thing about the sort of the psycho-geographical implications of architecture are that they influence you enormously. And I found this cathedral that I lived side by side with for 5 years had a huge impact on me, and not least some of the figures who were associated with it, particularly Thomas à Becket. And although I was an adolescent, I read about him, I understood the history, and I think one of the things I came away with was a very powerful sense of how dangerous it was for the church to take on the political establishment, but how important it was too, without any romantic illusions about the cost that one had to pay, given what happened to Becket himself. During those years, my teenage years, I lived as a Christian one year and an atheist the next. So I realized this was an important decision I had to make, and I really wouldn't know enough about these things unless I tried them out. But I went away to train to be a lawyer, and I had a particular two things happened. I drunk myself to death on a liter of vodka, and a year later, and was judged and sent back. A very odd out of the body experience. Although anyone involved in a near-death experience, literature realizes these things happen very often. I then had an evangelical conversion to Christianity as I followed this up sometime later, and found myself committed to Christ, but having no idea which church to join. And I thought I had three choices: the Pentecostals, because the charismatic movement was beginning in the 70s, or in the late 60s, really, but spreading a little. The Catholics, because I very much liked the local Catholic cathedral, and I could see that Catholicism was hardcore Anglicanism, or Anglicanism, which I mistrusted because I knew it very well, and I felt it had somehow managed to obscure the reality of Christ, which isn't at all fair, really, because there is a kind of spiritual awakening that takes place when we make our journey closer to Christ, and it's not obvious always why we can see one day and not another. I read something from C.S. Lewis that made me feel that God was telling me to stay an Anglican. My local priest told me I had a vocation to be a priest, and that upset me quite a lot because I wanted to be a lawyer, as my father was and my children are, and I nonetheless, it unleashed a sense of vocation that wouldn't leave me alone. It was like having as if I was a dog and someone had put a collar around me and a lead on the end of it, and so my freedom was taken away. So I was a reluctant Anglican priest, but nonetheless convinced that that was what God wanted me to do. Not wholly convinced, however, by the Church of England as an institution. I spent, I think nearly 40 years. I was an assistant priest and then a parish priest for 10 years. Then I was trained by the Jesuits in postgraduate psychology. I accumulated some degrees. With a PhD, I got 4 in all, and went to teach at a university where I lectured in the psychology of written and English, and spent 25 years there. During this period, I had an increasingly powerful sense that totalitarian Marxism was moving back into Europe. It's very hard to explain how that happened. I had smuggled Bibles into Moscow and Leningrad, as it was then, and Prague in the early 80s. And somewhere about 2005, I felt that I could smell or taste Marxist totalitarianism. It was a very strange experience. So I went to acquaint myself with what this might be. I could see the dangers that were coming in terms of the curtailing freedom of speech in the very radical university I worked in. That wasn't hard to see, but quite why they'd always been there to some extent. I then discovered the Frankfurt School, and I began to read a bit more carefully. I thought a little bit more about feminism and the progressive utopian agenda. And then I had a sense, I think before many others did, of what was going to come upon European Western society. And as that happened, the question then was how you resisted it, how Christians in particular resisted it, because it was always perfectly clear that Marxist utopianism tried to destroy the church and the Christian voice as one of its first acts. Anglicanism during that period became more quiescent and subservient. And I began to have the sense that Catholicism, perhaps also with Orthodoxy, but anyway, pre-schismatic, pre-1054 Christianity would probably be the only agency that had the power to resist what was coming. And it was like being on a trapeze in a high top. The trapeze I was on was giving way. There was a bigger and better trapeze just out of reach. At some point, I knew I was going to have to take the leap of faith and move from one to the other. During this time, I had been reading more, and from a spiritual point of view, I had become a Jungian really for about 20 years. But there was a good reason for that. It was because Jung provided me with a platform for undermining the influence of Freud in the academy. But then around about 1990, Jung became the dominant culture anyway. And Jung can be a friend if you're attacking Freud, but he can be an enemy if you have to choose between him and Jesus. And I found that I had become too Jungian. And the interesting thing that woke me up or changed me or propelled me back into Orthodox Christianity was some experiences with the demonic. And I have no idea why they happened. I know what happened, and I know the theological and spiritual implications of having them had happen, but why they should have erupted at a particular time and the ways that they did, I don't know. But I then one of my closest friends was a Catholic diocesan exorcist, and as we talked about the implications of what was happening to me, he recommended that I pray the Rosary. I began to pray the Rosary. I became deeply enamored with Our Lady. I acquainted myself with the history of her apparitions. I have a clear evidence that the praying of the Rosary was the most powerful spiritual, I don't want to use the word technique, engaging myself with the prayers of the Rosary together with Our Lady quite clearly unleashed, is that the right word? Engaged, perhaps, a degree of spiritual traction that I had never known before. One of the experiences was somehow being dive bombed by what I think must have been demons in a small chapel dedicated to St. Michael in Le Puy-en-Velay in the southwest of France. And it's all stopped when the host touched my lips. And I then began to look into Eucharistic miracles. And I came across Buenos Aires in 1994. And the combination of discovering what lay behind the Eucharistic miracles and a partnership with Our Lady in a struggle against evil drew me very close to Catholicism. I mean, as close as I could possibly be. And then in 2019, my local Catholic bishop said, "I think you're really Catholic. Would you please convert and come and help me in the diocese?" And to which I had to say, "Well, yes, of course. What else?" I mean, during that time also, I'd realized that without a magisterium, Anglicanism really couldn't find a united theological platform to do what needed to be done in Western society. So that's a very brief and rather patchy narrative of how I got from Anglicanism to being a Catholic layman as I am today.
Well, Gavin, to be honest, you've mentioned a couple of things there that I think I'm going to have you on again for, because there's the things about the demonic experiences that you had, and the even way before when you talk about the near-death experience. I want to get all those in, but I don't want us to rush them in now. So that's already very interesting, and I'm going to make a note of that. So it sounds like it was something that was building, the conversion to Catholicism. I was reading somewhere that there was an experience as well. I don't know if this was what you might call the final straw, where I think there was a church service going on that you were part of, and you said it was kind of like an ecumenical service, and they had a Muslim preacher reading there, and then he said some things that were basically saying that Jesus isn't divine, he isn't the Son of God. And was that something that kind of really pushed you over the edge, or was that not the thing? Was it that just another one of a number of things that caused it?
The way in which one interprets what happens to one spiritually can depend upon, I suppose, what level of the building we're looking at. On the ground floor, you could say, yes, this particular event, which I'll describe a little more closely but succinctly in a second, certainly energized my response and my objection. But I think I'd like to look at it from the top floor and say that within our lives, God calls us and directs us very often through circumstances without our being on top of what's going on. I think what was happening was the Anglican Church was becoming more irritated by my presence and my speaking out, and the long-standing Christian values that I was embodying and articulating. And I was simply being moved, almost like a sort of chemical reaction from one place to another, as the circumstances in life began to develop. But in this particular case, all that happened was, well, I should first of all say that I know quite a lot about Islam. I lectured in a postgraduate course on monotheism and metaphysics, and I have a number of Islamic colleagues. I also ran an interfaith team in the chaplaincy. And I was very struck in 2002 when one of my Islamic colleagues talked about the ambitions of the Muslim community in Great Britain, and said that they were confident that they would have Islamic Republic in the time of his grandchildren in 2 generations. I was astonished he should say that to me. It was a bit rude. And it seemed to me wildly outlandish. And I then went and looked at the demographics, and I saw that demographically speaking, he was entirely correct. And Islam, of course, is a very complicated phenomenon. It's both a political system as well as being a religious system. It has a huge spectrum of engagement, from ISIS at one end to your local retailer at the corner shop at the other. But it had alerted me to the ambitions of Islam, and therefore for the need for the Christian ecclesial community to distinguish itself from Islam, and in the kind of relativistic, multi-religious atmosphere that all education had been pushing for about 50 years. That was to swim against the tide. But that's partly because people knew very little either about Christianity or about Islam. But I think 2000 and, gosh, when would it have been? 15 perhaps. The Dean of a Scottish cathedral at the Epiphany Mass exchanged a reading of St. Paul for a surah of the Quran. And the particular surah, which was read in Arabic, no one understood it apart from the Muslims who were there to read it and to appreciate it. It was a surah that demotes Jesus. And effectively, faced with Jesus and Muhammad, both as prophetic figures, to put it at its most functional, they make different claims about themselves, and each cancels the other. You can't believe in both Jesus and Muhammad in the simplest way. In my natural thing, I think Muhammad's spiritual experiences were enormously complex and require great discernment to know what was going on. There was some very good and some very bad in there. But it struck me as being astonishing that any Christian community could, as part of the liturgy, read out this anti-Jesus surah. I asked myself if I should do anything about it, and in actual fact, this was Scotland, and ecclesiastically, it's a different province from England. I had no business being critical of the Scots dean, so I did nothing. The way I got involved was because the following 2 or 3 days later, the student community, I was quite well known amongst some students amongst English universities. The students got in touch with me and said, "Will you come to our aid? We've complained to the dean, who happens to be gay, about this piece of inappropriate Islamic hospitality. And he's reported us to the Scottish police, accusing us of homophobic hate crimes, when actually this has got nothing to do with the fact he's gay. We just object to having St. Paul replaced by Muhammad." So at that point, I wrote something in the newspapers and in the Times. And I got a phone call from Buckingham Palace. I suppose really I should have expected it long before. I knew I'd been irritating Lambeth Palace for quite some time. But every time I was approached by the senior Anglican hierarchy, who were anxious about some of the things I was saying in the public space, I said, "Well, show me where what I have said is either unchristian, un-Anglican, impolitic, inappropriate, mistaken, or whatever, and I'll adapt my behavior." But of course they never did, because the agenda was more subtle than that. However, the Lord Chancellor, not the Lord Chancellor, who's the man who runs Buckingham Palace? It'll come back to me in a moment. really the essential power behind the constitutional scenes, because most of the Queen's role is titular rather than executive, even within a palatial context, phoned me up and said, Dr. Ashenden, we have a problem. Can you help me solve it? And I said, well, it was quite late in the evening. I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how serious? About 9. I said, oh, well, let's apply our minds to this with some focus then. What's the problem? He said, well, the general public are under the impression that when you speak out in public, you speak not only on your own behalf, but you also speak the mind of the Queen. And the difficulty we have about this impression is it might be true. And then he said, the other problem we have is that the general public are under the impression that when you say things, the Queen pays attention to what you say and has her mind and judgment formed by what you say. And again, the difficulty is that might be true. So can you please help us? And as I was being given in a wonderfully English and subtle, understated way, the opportunity to do one of two things. I said, well, clearly I either swear myself to silence or else I resign. And he said, yes, that's a very good analysis of where we are. They were trying very hard to make sure they didn't push me out or I could never accuse them of sacking me, and that's perfectly reasonably. So I said, well, I forgive it some thought, but it was very clear to me I had to resign, so I resigned. That led to my finding myself in the public space, explaining what had happened. And I found myself on Fox News in America and on Radio 4 in England and on the Bolt Report in Australia, because the press weren't, people were saying people hadn't always got a hold of the right end of the stick. So I put my own webpage up and began to account for myself properly. And then found that I simply became, how do you explain? I mean, I think I had nearly 1 million hits on the website and during the first year. And so that was one of the events that then began to untie me from Anglicanism. It was then the bishop in the diocese, when I was a canon and theologian, became very uncomfortable with me, and then the Anglican Church consecrated women bishops, and I'd already come to a very clear view about the theological implications of gender. I mean, in those days, no one ever talked about them. It was always all political. It was, if men can do things, why can't women? Just to come to the most basic equality of outcome issues. Now, 5 or 6 years later, we're all much more alert as the whole transgender debate is tumbling around our ears to the fact that sex and gender issues have very profound political, psychological, democratic, and theological implications. And Christianity has a view on them. So that wasn't altogether clear 6 or 7 years ago as it is now, but I already had a sense of how important these things were and could be. And so the consecration of women as bishops was the point at which I left the Church of England.
Mm-hmm. And so 2 further questions now. Did you become a Catholic fairly soon after that? And also, did you consider becoming a Catholic priest or going into the clergy instead of just being a Catholic layman?
I think that becoming a Catholic requires a degree of almost conversion. I'm stuck with this image from St. John's Gospel of the man who was born blind, who was healed in 2 bits. So when Jesus healed him first, he saw figures moving around as trees, and then he required a second dose of healing. And theologically, this seems to me that healing offers a kind of paradigm, really. I had quite clearly had a conversion to Jesus, but I think one has to be, if you're born outside the Catholic Church, you have to be converted to Catholicism. And it's not at all obvious. Catholicism understands the faith in a way which contains some very serious high-octane mysteries, and you don't automatically get there just by arguing about them. And I also think, and this is a more profound and difficult issue, but I think that spiritually, as one approaches Catholicism, one encounters a certain degree of adverse weather. So you find yourself with opposition theologically, socially, but also metaphysically. So no, I didn't. I was asked by some continuing Anglicans in America to become an Anglican missionary bishop with the view to providing a renewed Anglican ecclesiastical presence as increasingly people left the Church of England because of its capitulation to secular culture. And I very reluctantly accepted this responsibility because it was something I'd like to have seen happen. I thought there was a lot of virtue in good Anglicanism at the time. My wife became a Catholic, and we started to go to Mass early on Sunday morning and then to the Anglican Eucharist after that. And doing that for a year and a half had a profound effect on me. Again, it wasn't theological or social, it was spiritual, and to my spiritual antennae. And so it was when my local bishop said, look, it's time you joined us. We think from what you write and say in public that really you're properly Catholic, and do not think so. The answer was, well, yes, I am. It's the moment. But what I'm trying to communicate, I think, was it wasn't a matter of rationally or in my own spectrum of preference making choices that suited me. I had a sense that I was doing what God asked of me at the time he asked it.
Right. Well, as a Catholic, then I'm going to ask you some opinions on some things that have been happening recently in relation to the Catholic faith.
Yes.
The first thing, you probably have heard about all these stories, but to do with Notre Dame, there was
yes.
there are plans, and these plans, it seems, have just recently been approved to do some things with the design inside Notre Dame. I think the outside it's been accepted that that's going to be done as it was, but it was with the design inside that there was some various kind of people putting forward their ideas. Some of these ideas involved taking out confessionals, altars, and classical sculptures and replacing them with art murals and some sound and lighting effects, creating emotional spaces. Also a discovery trail leading visitors through various chapels with an emphasis on Africa and Asia. Different kind of scripture being beamed out onto the walls in many languages so people can understand, including Mandarin and so other things like that. And the reasons for this that were given, well, one of the main reasons was that, now with so many visitors and so many of these visitors being from countries all over the world where Christianity isn't necessarily in their culture and it's not something that they're a part of, we need to kind of cater to them a little bit more. And it seems as though most of these have been approved from what I was reading just recently in the Times. I think the only things they didn't approve were having mobile benches with ambient lighting and taking statues out of chapels that were there. What do you make of these ideas to redesign the interior of Notre Dame?
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm a very great fan of Archbishop Michel Aupetit, the Archbishop of Paris, as he was until a few days ago. And I'm very distressed by the fact that the Pope has accepted his resignation, because although it was on the basis of an alleged impropriety of a low-level kind 10 years ago, the Pope has refused resignation of people whose reputation for immorality has far exceeded it in terms of clerical child abuse and other forms of improper behavior. And I think that his removal is not unconnected with the renovations of Notre Dame, because I think that insofar as he had a say in it, he would have done everything he could to maintain the traditional authenticity of Catholicism. Because the French are in a difficult position that all their buildings are owned by the state. And so although I haven't had time to look at exactly which committee has what power to suggest what, there's no question at all that the church is in a place of conflict with the state, who owns their buildings. But leaving aside those issues for the moment, the bigger question you've asked is the extent to which the church should modernize or buy into some kind of progressive agenda to accommodate itself to other people. And I think this is based on a really quite an appalling error of judgment. I think I would probably say that as I read spirituality, or history of spirituality, one of the great peaks of Christian civilization are the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries in Europe. And Notre Dame embodies them in a particularly intense and particular way. But the church itself has swallowed an utterly non-Christian idea, which is the idea of progress, and that somehow both the relativism implied in the notion of progress today and the lack of distinctiveness of Christianity, or the offensiveness of its claims, are things that the church has to accommodate itself to. Well, the opposite is the case. So what the church should be doing is restoring Notre Dame to its embodiment of one of the most profound periods of Christian culture, where Christianity expressed itself geographically and architecturally. Jordan Peterson is very good on the implications and the relationship between spirituality, psychology, philosophy, and architecture, and talks about the way in which the facile and empty state we are in metaphysically expresses itself in the kind of buildings we build and the art we create, the so-called music we produce. Well, it's just I can hardly believe that anyone with a grasp of Christian spirituality or history or theology would ever want to accommodate itself to a period of culture in which degenerate secularism is at its most intense, and it may get more intense. So it's the most terrible error of spiritual and theological judgment, though it may be driven by political realities that are specific to the French situation.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I wanted to ask you about recently, and there's been a whole spate of these, to be honest, but there was another statue that was attacked. This one, the Our Lady of Fatima statue in Washington, D.C. It's just outside the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. There's CCTV footage of somebody kind of hammering away at the head of the Blessed Mother, and then I think he chopped her hands off. And there's been a lot of these happening, and I think sometimes, I think it's always wrong, but sometimes when it happens to, say, someone like Junipero Serra, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but Saint Junipero Serra, I can see the thinking behind it, even though I feel the thinking is wrong, because they've been told a bunch of things about him. They think he was a racist and so on, and then they attack. But when we see statues of Jesus and Mary being attacked, what can we attribute that to? Is it just is it sort of mental health issues? Is it just some kind of weird misguided anger at the church because there's so much negativity about the church in media? Why would someone go, for example, to a statue of the Virgin Mary and start wanting to take it down? I find that I struggle to understand that. Do you know why that might be?
Well, yes, no, I do. And I think, first of all, the explanations you've given are very good ones. Those are certainly elements. People are misinformed. There is some kind of projective rage against the church. Some of it's justified in terms of the very bad behavior of the church institutionally and the appalling things that happened to do with child abuse. But again, I think it's always quite important for us to decide what kind of, if you like, which telescope we're going to look through, or what lenses we're going to look through, because we always have a choice. We can interpret things sociologically, politically, psychologically, medically, biologically. Every time that we look at the human condition, there are a number of different disciplines and insights we can use. But one of the ones that we're worst at and we find most embarrassing is a spiritual or metaphysical lens. And to my mind, it's a no-brainer from a Christian point of view that Our Lady makes the devil very cross. And if Our Lady is who we take her to be, and if the devil is who we find out that he is in the Gospels and in tradition and the experience of the Church, we ought, as Catholics, to recognize that we live in a permanent state of metaphysical and spiritual war. During this war, the enemy often makes large inroads into the Church. And so not all the inroads are the ones people think of. And I remember being quite struck when I discovered for the first time that I think the casualties to the Spanish Inquisition, which is often held up by atheists and secularists being a very low point in the Church's history, as indeed it is. But I think 800 people were executed. Well, that's 800 too many. But if you compare that with people who Obama killed as he attacked Afghanistan and in his foreign policy, where there are in the hundreds of thousands, what the Church did compared to what the state did is minimal. Doesn't make what the Church did right. The same thing is true when you compare the deaths of the progressive left in the 20th century. They come to nearly 200 million people deliberately killed by an ideology. I think one of the things Christians often fail to understand is that we live in a spiritually contested place. That's what the Gospels tell us that very clearly. St. John tells it most clearly. And Our Lady, this is certainly my experience when it came to dealing with evil. Our Lady is very powerful indeed. And so she enrages wherever evil has found a foothold or an entrance point or a platform or a sphere of influence. Our Lady makes them very cross. And in fact, probably one of the interesting theological questions is why sometimes Our Lady is more provocative towards regarding evil than our Lord is. And that there's another interesting theological question I've been thinking about for a few years. But you'll often find that statues of Mary provoke a far greater rage amongst people who are in some kind of way energized by the demonic or by evil or by rage. There's no overlap between all of those things. So I'm afraid I would simply say the statues of Our Lady act as a barometer for the spiritual weather. And when the spiritual crisis that we're in at the moment, as we have willfully abandoned the responsibility and the virtues and the graces that we have inherited as a Church, is that we're now in a very difficult spiritual conflict, and we're on the back foot. And one of the things the Church needs to do is to work out how, given our own analysis of the situation, our own resources, how we reconfigure ourselves, our attitudes, our prayer life, our penitence, to deal with that. Because if we go much further on the back foot, we'll find ourselves in an increasingly beleaguered situation. One, I think that Pope Benedict foresaw in that remarkable piece he wrote in 1979 about a shriven, diminished Catholic Church.
Well, thank you very much, Gavin Ashenden, for your time. The final thing I just want to say, is there any way you'd like to point the audience to maybe to your website, or I think you have a YouTube channel as well, don't you?
Oh, yes. Well, absolutely. So I have a YouTube channel and a website. And if you find what I'm doing is helpful, come along. It's ashenden.org is the website. And the YouTube channel, well, just has to Google it and you'll come across it. And so yes, by all means, I'd be very nice to welcome some more friends.
It's a very interesting chat. I'll put those links actually in the description anyway. Gavin Ashenden, thank you very much for your time. To be honest, you've touched on so many things that I can see that I'm already going to want to talk to you a few more times to go into further detail on just some of the things you mentioned there. But thanks again for your time. It was a very interesting conversation, and I hope the viewers have enjoyed it. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day.
It's been lovely to talk to you. Thank you for having me on your show. Bless you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.